Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to our webinar that will focus on the recycling of artificial turf in our industry. My name is Neil McPhee. I am a sports engineer, graduated from Strathclyde University many years ago, and now been working in the sports surface and technology sector for about 15 years. I'm Associate Director at Sports Labs. A lot of you may know us from certification of testing surfaces around the world. And I also sit on global governing body technical working groups and advisory committees. Today, the webinar will be run on the live events platform. It's a Microsoft platform. You have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar. And as we have over 100 people on the call today, we will try and get through everyone's questions. We'll do our best. The panelists will do their best as well to answer the questions. But I apologise, and we will revisit the questions if we can't get them all done within the allocated time slot. There will also be a report, the survey report, issued after the webinar, and you can read into more detail the findings of the survey. We will also have a format quite interactive today where we'll invite the panelists to answer questions on key topics, and we'll also have a few keynotes from some of the panelists throughout the webinar. As I say, we'll try and be as interactive as possible and answer the questions, so please by all means don't hesitate to ask us. We are very lucky today to introduce a leading expert panel from within our sector of sports surfacing and also out with our sector, which gives us two perspectives, which is fantastic. Dr. Catherine Severn is the Framework and Procurement Manager for the Football Foundation. Catherine brings a wealth of knowledge and understanding from our industry today with the hat of a large investor in surfaces from the Football Foundation, to previous days of a testing institute and experience in installation from the contractor's point of view. We are very, very lucky to have Catherine on the call with us today, as the Foundation are releasing around about 400 pitches over 4 years. We will hear from Catherine on the positive steps the Football Foundation and Framework are taking, and thank you, Catherine, for joining today. Additionally, we have Chris Whittaker from the British Association for Sustainable Sport. Chris is a founding member and sits on the BASIS Steering Committee. Welcome, Chris. The Sustainability for Sport in the UK is a non-profit community committed to achieving positive impacts at entry level, and that includes different sports from tennis, football, cricket, and some of their key members are the likes of Wimbledon in tennis, Arsenal in football, the Principality Stadium in rugby, a major stadium, and also Lord's Cricket Ground. I think it's good to invite Chris to this conversation because he comes from out with the sports surface sector, which is great, and also they have an online sustainability course delivered by BASIS that we might talk about a little bit later. Chris's experience really comes from the cricket ECB and delivery and implementation of NGB funding programmes in the recreational game. Then we have Luke McGeechan, active on the ground from the Sportex Group. Luke is a commercial director as a sports facility company specialising in the construction, refurbishment and maintenance of external sports facilities. And with over 50 years experience in sports such as football, rugby, hockey and athletics and tennis, as well as multi-use, they have a very diverse range of clients from local government to independent schools, universities, professional regional sports clubs, to even the Ministry of Defence and the Prison Service. And these facilities are usually procured and delivered in the UK to the governance of the likes of SAPCA, Sport Scotland and Sport England guidelines. Luke is very interesting to have on the panel today because in 2020 they were the UK's first and only sports surfacing company to offer a sustainable recycling end of pitch lifetime solution. Bespoke recycling plant in Grangemouth, where landfill is no longer the final destination for up to 1.5 million metres of old surfacing or turf every year. Compliant and fully traceable solutions. So this is great to have Luke's input today on where we might see the market in the future and what are the current limitations, and also how we protect the planet and deliver those cost savings to clients that we've mentioned that Luke is dealing with. And finally, and last but not least, is Eric O'Donnell, the Managing Director of Sports Labs, who has over 30 years experience himself in the sports surface sector and advises on global governing bodies and working groups. He's one of the two founders of Sports Labs who can be found in 4 continents with 7 global offices. Many of the webinar delegates will know Sports Labs from the work as mentioned from certifying services around the world, but more importantly, Eric sits as chair of the End of Life Working Group for ESTC, the EMEA Synthetic Turf Council, and they're making great strides in end of life practices and documents. So we'll hear from Eric a little bit later about that as well. So we're going to jump into the survey now. We're going to look at the key criteria of the survey, why we did it, and some of the key focuses. So the objective at the start was really to engage with stakeholders in the market, an open platform, and to take their perception and see what we can do with their perception. We reached out globally in an open format on Google Forms. It was inclusive for all. We initially shared it through our readership and social media platforms. And the survey was conducted with 32 questions where there was the opportunity to comment back in some of the questions where we've seen an opportunity to learn more. As we move towards a sustainable future in the synthetic turf industry, we need to embrace this good practice, and albeit legislation in the future might be where we end up, we still need to embrace this voluntary at the moment so we can make positive change. And I think when we look at turf being 100% recyclable, that might be true, but is it commercial and feasible in the current day and age, and what are those limiting factors? These are the kind of things that we tried to focus on in our survey, so we can work towards quicker positive change. The details of the survey, participation rates, we had 117 people participate, which equated to 3,744 questions answered, with additional comments above and beyond those numbers. We had a diverse range of stakeholders that we'll look into across 7 different continents that were represented, and the window for participation was in 1 month in July. We looked at 5 themes. These are not exhaustive, but something we'll look in more detail in our analysis with our panellists. So in terms of knowledge and research, what's available in the market for people around the world to access and improve their learning. Also, the enabling factors was one of the criteria. What are the key barriers in our industry? Number 3, we looked at the quality control and the material quality. Number 4, we looked at the cost of the material. And number 5, we'll delve into the accessibility of the plant and the material. So before we involve the panelists and introduce them to discussion, we're just going to run through a little bit more of the executive summary in the report. The report will be made available to all webinar participants later in the week, and you'll also get a rerun of the webinar as mentioned previously. So when we look at the participants, we had 49% of our participants were manufacturer contractors. We had a low participation rate of governing bodies, national and global, at 5%. We also had other sectors included that weren't in the drop-down list, such as users and natural turf representatives. In terms of regions, the highest return was Europe, which is not unsurprising considering the amount of manufacturers and activity in Europe, at 43%. Accumulatively, the Americas is 24%, and this was a multiple choice question. We also had a question regarding the number of memberships, question 4, and only 33% are aware of codes of practice in their memberships, and more alarmingly, 20% of members of bodies that have no codes or are unaware of their codes. We also asked a question in number 7 about a tax allowance, and 61% in some form agreed with the tax allowance, and 17% disagreed in some form with a tax allowance. In terms of recycled material, in question 8 we asked a question about the quality, and 19% replied in some form that is poor, and 36% replied in some form that is good enough. The other return was average at 44%. In terms of the availability of the material, 21% are satisfied to some degree, and 60% are dissatisfied to some degree. Easy for me to say. In terms of reuse and recycling participation in question 15, 9% are not active in reuse or recycling in any capacity, and 79% are active in reuse and recycle in some capacity, which is very encouraging statistics. Additionally, we looked a little bit more detail into the percentage of people's participation, and we can say that 39% are active above 50% of their general practices. So they take the opportunity more than 50% of the time to get involved in recycling and reuse in their day-to-day routines and operations. In terms of research time, we asked the question, and 61% of people or participants are investing time in research, and I think this is a great opportunity and very encouraging if we can give them the right material consistently across continents and platforms and governing bodies. Trust and disposal. So we asked the question, and I think 42% are somewhat satisfied that the turf has been removed from site as agreed. Unfortunately, 26% are very dissatisfied, and the most popular term being somewhat dissatisfied was 36%. That was question 18. In terms of disposal checks, only 29% of participants are involved in some sort of checks on the disposal of the material at end of use. The availability of material to read, the satisfaction, 62% as mentioned are dissatisfied to some degree with the availability of the material. And in terms of recycling facilities, 66% replied that they had no local recycling facilities. And I think this is an opportunity, obviously, in the future, if we see more facilities available. Very, very encouragingly, 85%, a large majority, support the reuse or recycled materials back in the industry. And in terms of turf price sensitivity, 98% of participants think it's acceptable to pay more for recycled turf to some degree. So jumping back, we look at the learning outcomes and the key understandings and terminologies. And I think what we can see is sometimes they're lost and they need direction, which is a good focus for us. The trade associations bodies could provide a little bit more support and resources. So a lot of this data, the findings and the conclusions, gives us basis for discussion and to understand the perception of stakeholders in the industry, not just locally but around the world. So what we're going to do now is we're going to select one question, which is one of our key focuses, so there's 5, and we're going to discuss them with our panel. Okay, so we're looking here at question 11 in regards to knowledge and research resources, and it's quite a compelling response. The perception is that we do not have enough knowledge in our industry and access to knowledge, and the foundations of what we do can be hamstrung by the lack of knowledge. So I suppose the question is this a worrying response? I'll open up to you, Chris, in terms of in other sports sectors. Does this resonate with changes in cultures and where we go going forward, and have they had similar problems like this, what we're looking at?
Yeah, thank you, Niall, and thanks for inviting me onto the panel. And just to say, this survey, I think, is going to play a really important role in people's kind of understanding of where we are in terms of recycling. Yeah, very much it does resonate, because that's probably one of the big problems, is the lack of kind of joined up thinking around different frameworks, different codes of practice. It seems that every sport has its own, so there's nothing kind of codified in a universal way, if you like. And it is one of the reasons why we set up BASIS all that time ago, was very much to kind of share practice amongst practitioners and amongst the different sports. So in terms of kind of best practice, probably some of our members adhere to that. You probably saw Arsenal recently, and the Emirates signed up to the UN. I can't remember exactly which charter it was, but it's they're the first sporting body to do it. And Wimbledon, you know, are kind of out there as one of the probably best practices of and implementers of sustainable practice. So yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of the resonating part of it, very much. I'm pleased that those were the responses, in fact, because I think there is a lot of education that can be brought to bear. Okay, so thank you very much, Chris.
good to hear that. And in terms of Look as a recycling provider, do you find yourself educating clients and stakeholders more than what you predicted? I think you're still on mute, Luke.
I would echo a lot of what Chris just said there. I think education is probably one of the biggest challenges we face. You know, apologies to the international viewers. I can really only speak for the UK market, but you know, ultimately, we for the last 25 years as an industry have been used to getting rid of old artificial turf through landfill or through other creative means. So we've got a massive culture and a massive mindset that we need to change across the industry, not just with buyers, where I have most direct engagement, but with manufacturers, consumers, you know, and we need a complete vertical integration of the whole industry to buy into, you know, this need that we have to change our working practices. So yeah, I would absolutely say that knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, and general education of the industry is a massive challenge that we all need to buy into, and we all need to try and make better.
Yes, it's definitely a big challenge. Look, and I suppose, Catherine, from your point of view as a large investor in the framework, I mean, is there ways that we can tackle this, obviously, as a national in the UK? Is there something that we can do going forward?
Yes, definitely. So the Football Foundation has developed a framework for delivering artificial grass pitches. So we've just started the third iteration of the framework, and as part of this new framework, we have set out employers' requirements, including end-of-life recycling as a specific requirement, of which obviously all the suppliers would need to adhere to. As well as that, we've also set up a working group within the framework. So the framework is essentially an alliance contract which incorporates collaborative working across all its members, so the suppliers, ourselves, the specialist testing consultancy, the framework management consultancy. And one of the working groups we've set up is for recycling and end of use. And that working group will look at examining best practice, sharing information around products, services, legislation, and trying to encourage production of guidance with other NGBs, trade associations. So we kind of have a joint guidance that all sports essentially can use, and where it needs to be specific to a sport, it's specific, but to try and formalise some form of general guidance for our sports industry is something that we'll be looking to push as part of that working group on the framework.
That's really good to hear, Catherine. Very interesting that you're making those steps, and I applaud that. I guess from my point of view, the research or the knowledge to share in the industry is the easy bit. You know, I think if we can have a consistent voice across all continents on what's good practice and bad practice, it's something we can definitely deliver on. You know, sometimes a lot of the stuff is out with our control, such as the plants legislation, but this is definitely something we can address with national government bodies. Okay, so we're going to jump to the next slide, and on the next slide we're going to look at enabling factors. And when we look at enabling factors, it's quite an interesting question, because we asked obviously what were the key barriers to the recycling of synthetic materials, and every single option returned was given the full reply. So clearly we have not just one thing to focus on, but quite a few things. Now, the abbreviations there, so we have lack of understanding, we have legislation, no clear rewards for recycling, such as quality scoring and tendering, lack of clear end use for the recycling materials, and availability of plant. So I guess the first question is, you know, how do we overcome these in the next 10 years? But from your point of view, Luke, can you maybe talk us through some of the things that makes an accessible plant a timely and costly exercise, and is there hope in expecting big strides in the next few years in this sector?
Well, we hope so, because something needs to change. You know, I can only talk from our own experience. You know, where we are now has been 4.5 years in the making. It's been a colossal amount of time, effort, money, frustration, problems, challenges, and we're still not at the finish line. We've made a tremendous amount of progress in terms of where we want to be, but there are still things we need to develop and improve on. So I think, you know, where we've come at it isn't just about availability of plant. It's pretty obvious in the UK there's been a complete dearth of availability of recycling solutions. We're someone who's trying to change that, but the availability of plant, as this survey has already shown, isn't just the single factor. We've touched on education, but there's also got to be a market demand. You could look at it simply and say, well, you know, millions of square meters of turf are being lifted in the UK and globally every year, but is there a demand from the buyer to sustainably recycle that end-of-life turf? And that goes back to the points we were talking about: education, change of culture, change of mindset. So, you know, what we've tried to do is we've tried to create a economically or commercial viable solution that is scalable. So hopefully, as these things that we've spoken about in terms of education, mindset, market demand increase and improve, from our point of view, we have a solution that we can scale up to meet that demand. And that, from my perspective at least, as a contractor, is the approach that we've taken here. But as I say, I think things do need to change, and you would like to think that more options will be available to the market in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. I think one of the things that really makes it easier is the correct terminology, and that's something that was resonating through the survey that we did. I think I suppose a no clear reward, Kath, is quite an interesting one with the framework. In the future, you talk about the technical working group, and you know, is that something that not maybe just the framework, but particularly in the UK, we can expect consultants to start tender scoring based on recycling and sustainability more in the mix? Is that something we expect?
I would say so, yes, and I say we're maybe starting to see some of that influence now, but the influence is maybe coming from the client, particularly local authorities or big procurement bodies, where environmental impacts and sustainability are kind of quite high up on their agendas now. So I think we are starting to see a turn, or at least the questions being asked. And as part of the working group, it's one of the topics for us to discuss, whether we look to maybe bring in a quality score around sustainability and recycling. Our employers' requirements are quite stringent in terms of what options we will allow through the framework, but still, if we think that there are innovative and new solutions, but potentially might come at a higher price, but we think you know, value for money is there, particularly in the long term, then these are things that we're willing to explore to make sure that we're making the right choices moving forward.
Okay, yeah. I think I suppose, Chris, you know, we're and looking in our own industry here, you know, we're all coming from the sports surfacing sector. In terms of legislation, is this something that should be reality in the future? You know, the fact that it has to be a sustainable, fully recyclable model. Is that something that we should be really pushing right now?
Yes, definitely. Sorry, I'm not sure I'm live.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, definitely we should be, and certainly legislation is going to enable that. But I think in order to get legislation properly embedded and enforced, you need the understanding, and you need, you know, the full buy-in from everybody to make sure that the end of life recycling is done in an appropriate and cost-effective way. Yeah, I mean, legislation obviously drives things rapidly, and we've seen, for example, the, you know, taking out petrol and diesel cars has come about far more quickly than anybody expected. And, you know, from the original targets of 2050, you know, that's now down to 2030. So solutions are going to be found quickly, because obviously necessity is the mother of invention. So I would hope in similarly in this space the same thing happens. I mean, it has been frustrating because, you know, I've been involved in this certainly when I was at the ECB and looking at recycling options from, you know, it's probably 6-7 years ago, and kind of from then to now, really not much has changed. We're still not recycling, and there isn't any kind of policy for end of use. And you know that when an artificial pitch is installed, the person or company who installs it has the responsibility to make sure that is taken out and recycled. So yeah, legislation will move things on quickly.
Yeah, I think you know, hopefully in the future it does become reality. And I think your cat's joining us in the background, Chris. It's quite it's saying hello. So.
Mine? No, I haven't got one.
It's at the window. So so we're going to jump to the next question. The next question is again basically looking at the enabling factors, and I suppose who plays the biggest change in the mindset, and I suppose in the industry, who has the biggest authoritative position to make change. And you can see the category that we asked the participants from client, consultant, contractor, field, customer owner, football federation, government, etc. I think from my point of view, I look at that and see football federation very, very low. And I think sometimes the football federation sometimes has and each member association has a good position to share knowledge and transfer. I guess the question is, look from your side again. You know, you're in the coalface. You're talking to people that are buying the pitches. Who has authority to really push this through? The stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders that are key in doing this?
Well, government. Yes, Chris touched on there. You know, central government have the most influence and most power to do something about it. As he rightly said, legislation works. You only need to look at the levy that was placed on plastic bags, however long ago that was, 10 or so years ago, to see that created this change in culture that we've discussed on this call. So, but until that comes to pass, if it does ever come to pass, then yeah, you need buy-in from ultimately the purchasers of these facilities, and you know, that can be a difficult thing to achieve on a national scale, because bluntly, different people have different views on the environment. And whilst we all like to think that we all care about the environment and we all want to make a change, some people don't, and some of those people happen to own synthetic turf facilities. So in the immediate future, the change of mindset or change of culture needs to come from buyers. But the question that's then posed is, well, how do we do that? And to me, that then comes back to what we've discussed about education and trying to get the message out across all areas of the industry, across all stakeholders, about the need for this and what's out there and what the options are to people. So yeah, government have the most influence, but ultimately just now I think it's the buyers of these facilities, either at a local level, national level, private sector, public sector, it doesn't matter. They all need to be given the information as to where we are with this.
Okay, thank you, Luke. I think we've got a comment there from Bob Sharples that surely professional bodies such as RTPI, REBA, RICS have a role to play as well as Sport England and Sport Scotland. And I completely agree with you, Bob, on those comments. I think the more national, international bodies that can share that message of good practice and where they have a position in terms of finance control, then yes, for sure. Okay, so we're going to jump forward again to the next slide. And the next one we're going to look at is the quality control. In terms of the quality control, we wanted to look at the voluntary codes and the practice of bodies national, and we had some interesting findings. And I suppose one of the questions is 56% of participants follow a code of practice, but only 19% follow codes through a membership. So what does that say, I suppose, about the bodies and how the codes of practice or legislation or guidance from bodies can be used in industry? I suppose, Catherine, again, coming back to the Football Foundation, looking into this at the moment, is there codes in the pipeline? Do you think it's something, not just nationally, in the UK, but internationally, is it something that we should have a consistent approach to?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the moment, obviously, as a framework, we're implementing employers' requirements in accordance with existing UK legislation and, in and around the wage hierarchy. But what we need to do really is encourage some joined up thinking around generic guidance documents and codes of practice that, potential applicants and clients can follow as part of their design, and not only the applicants, but the wider industry, so designers, consultants, installers and contractors. So yeah, there isn't anything, there's no formal guidance or policy, I would say, at the moment directing or guiding people through what is best practice around recycling of AGPs. But it is something that the NGB, Sport England and some of the other trade associations such as SAPCA are starting to talk about and discuss, and it's now an agenda point as something that we need to start doing. And I think the consensus is that a joined up approach is probably the best approach, so that everybody's reading the same information as opposed to several different documents.
Okay, yeah, I think it's a very good cue for Chris here, because BASE's position in the market and SAPCA in the UK, we're focusing here in the UK. There's an opportunity to drive that guidance, and I suppose you can tell us a little bit about what BASEs are doing in the future with SAPCA.
Yep, thanks, Niall. Yeah, very much agree, or picking up on Catherine's point about no kind of consistency in terms of policy and codes of conduct or codes of practice. I'd be interested to know where people are saying they are following a code of practice, what it is they're following, because obviously there is such a variety of best practice in that it'd be interesting to know what it is exactly they're following. Yeah, so our ambition at BASES is very much to try and join up these codes of practice and to come up with something that's a common standard. So we've launched just recently a certification scheme to try and encompass that and to bring people kind of on that journey of sustainability. So regardless of where they are in the along the timeline, they'll be able to get into the scheme and then work towards a kind of common goal. Working with SAPCA, yeah, so we've recently just kind of signed a partnership agreement with them to deliver their kind of sustainability communications and training, and again try and bring a sort of consistency into the market. It has been a gap, certainly in terms of the training that's offered, and at the moment we're doing a kind of entry-level principles of sustainability course, which is running live at the moment, and then we'll be running more next year. And that again is to try and bring all those principles across all the different areas of sport together and bring them into a sort of common and accepted definitions of what everybody thinks sustainability should be and how it gets embedded into sport. So yeah, in terms of what we're doing in the marketplace, you know, kind of watch the space. We are delivering and working on programs to, say, bring some kind of consistency.
Good, very good to hear, Chris. I think one of the things that I look at that graph, I see no as 29%. I see that as a massive opportunity, as well as a very good 56% following a code of practice. There's an opportunity there. So I think we'll jump forward to the next one, which was looking at the material quality. It's quite an important one, and the material quality is perceived different components different ways. But I think what's important here is that there's a high percentage of good and average responses. Now, does that mean that we're accepting the material that we're seeing? And of that material, we should probably go a step further and ask for each component what's acceptable and what's not. And maybe that's the next survey that we look at. But I suppose, Luke, do you get a similar response with the material that you're reproducing? Does that resonate with what you're finding?
Well, obviously we're striving to produce the best product that we can, and you know, Eric will testify that, you know, we've seen very good progress, in particular with the infill materials on that front. I suppose the point I would make as someone who's trying to bring a solution to the market is that the disparity in the condition of the end-of-life turf that you lift is unbelievable, and that is the challenge. Or that has been one of the biggest challenge for us, is that, you know, not just the type and the age, but its condition, cleanliness. There's so many factors that will influence the quality of output that we can get from that end-of-life carpet. So, you know, we've had to create a solution that is versatile and adaptable to accept different conditions of turf. And even now, we're still learning new things and trying to overcome new challenges on that. So I think, you know, any solution has got to be able to produce products that are equal or better than what the market is used to. And certainly from our viewpoint, that's what we're striving to do.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke. We're going to jump forward to the next slide, and we're going to look at cost now. The cost is an interesting one again. You know, when you look at the components, but we specifically asked this question about turf in terms of paying more for turf, and 98% of the participants of the survey accepted it was you should be paying more for the turf. I suppose, Catherine, I'm quite encouraged by this. Would you be encouraged by this? I suppose, from the Football Foundation's point of view, there might be an offset with other components in the future. If we can repurpose the sand and the rubber better, as what Luke was alluding to, then maybe we can afford to pay a little bit more for recycled turf. Does that make sense? Yeah,
it is positive, and I guess from a framework perspective, we might be in maybe a slightly different position from maybe many other procurement routes, in that we can potentially look at this as individual options on project by project basis, and you know, bring it into our tendering process and scoring process to, you know, try and encourage the use of recycled materials where we think that they are suitable and appropriate. And you know, any recycled materials we use would still need to meet all of our requirements. I guess the flip side is, I think whilst people appear to be accepting and willing to pay more, I guess the reality is how many of them then actually go and purchase it when they're competing against others, and a lot of the time it comes down to price. And I think that's, I guess, where the big question comes. I think people are willing to pay for it, but I would suggest that many of them probably aren't at the moment when it comes to competitive tendering, because they might feel that they'll lose out if you know, a quality element around sustainability and the environment isn't kind of taken into consideration if it's just price based.
Yeah, I think I completely hear what you're saying. I think we asked a question about tax allowances and if that should be incorporated, and 61% believe there should be a tax allowance. And I guess that's where that tendering aspect comes in. You know, it's good practice, but it puts you out of the ballpark. And I guess if everyone has that tax allowance, then it will really help level the playing field. Chris, are you surprised by that high level of acceptance, 98%?
No, like you, it is quite heartening to see that. But I suppose maybe it's tied in slightly to the question around legislation, because if legislation is brought in, then the willingness to pay more would be, I think, increased. Yeah, well, hopefully, what Catherine was saying there about the kind of race to the bottom in terms of pricing, if it becomes something that's embedded as part of the tendering process, then it's not something anybody can avoid, and therefore the costs are worked into their tender bid. Yeah.
Interestingly, Chris, sorry to jump in there. When we asked the question about sand and rubber, different components, there was still a high level of acceptance, but it wasn't as high. So 72% thought it was more acceptable to pay higher, but obviously not the dizzy heights of 98%. So it's still there. Still people are reacting positively. I guess what Catherine said is really paramount. People can say they'll pay more, but when it puts them out of a competitive price, then it's.
I think it's more, like when you buy a cup of coffee, you pay 5p for the cup because they're going to recycle it. Then probably don't notice that so much. But so very small percentages as an increase probably will be acceptable. But when we see, 20-30% increase in price, which is probably what we might see at the moment, and obviously we're at early days on having recyclable products, but that becomes quite difficult in terms of procurement. And we'd have to change procurement policies to recognise the value of a sustainable product or a recycled product, so that when you're evaluating a tender, that's taken account of. That's the difficulty I think we're in at the moment.
Yeah, and there's a kind of wider discussion here as well. So if you're talking about tax breaks, the tax breaks should be for innovative thinking in terms of the source products that are used, because ultimately we don't want more plastic coming into the system, because really I think the ultimate goal should be a closed loop system for plastic, i.e. all the plastic that's out there already is the plastic that gets used to remake, or also to make new artificial pictures. So yeah, I think you need to be careful about the tax breaks and how they get implemented and what they get implemented for.
Okay, good point, Chris. Good to pick up on. The last one we wanted to look at was accessibility, and obviously currently the prices of recycling are sometimes not achievable or feasible. And I guess when we look at a distance to move the turf and how far we have to go to find a recycling plant, that's a problem. In the UK and Ireland we have quite a small territory, but there's big countries out there, for example Russia, America, and these countries have a lot of distance to cover. So being carbon neutral in transportation is an issue. So when we asked the question here, most people were looking at regional transport, and I guess that's probably what we have to try and look towards, having recycling plants locally based. And I suppose Luke, one of the questions I had for you, is it possible to segregate the infill on site in the future, and is that something that we can really look at a model as an industry?
Personally, I would say no. But you would expect me to say that. We looked at that. I think there's a number of reasons that make that challenging. Licensing being one, because ultimately end of life turf is a classified waste. There'd be so many variables to try and contend with there, because pitches up and down the UK are different locations, different access challenges or not, and ultimately if you're processing a waste on site, you'd have all sorts of potential issues with noise, vibrations, dusts, all of which need to be regulated. So listen, there's no getting away from the fact that if you have to take 8-9 loads of old artificial turf and transport it 200-300 miles, there's an environmental impact. With that, I suppose there's a counter argument to that, which is, well, is that potentially offset by not needing to quarry sand or potentially process tyres for rubber, because ultimately you can reclaim the infill from that end of life turf and reuse it. So yeah, I think transport unfortunately is a necessary evil initially. If we get the change of culture and mindset and we see the recycling of end of life turf as being the norm, then I think transport will become less of an issue. But certainly in the infancy stages of where we are as an industry, it is a necessary evil.
I suppose one of the things in the future is, as countries start to hit their threshold for artificial pitches, it'll be more resurfacing than new builds. Is that something, the framework that you're aware of, Catherine, that obviously some of the percentages might change over the next few years? Yes,
definitely. I think we're very conscious, I think, of the pitches that we've invested in to date, and those pitches will need refurbishing at some point, and those numbers will continue to increase. And I guess just picking up on Luke's, at the moment the transportation is a bit of a necessary evil because the options in the UK are few. I think the positive is there are potential options on the table and new opportunities, obviously, such as the one that Luke's working on. And I think hopefully, and particularly I guess it has, you assume legislation and policies will start to change to push people down this route anyway, that the options will become a bit more readily available. And I think particularly important where it's the end user then that may have to find that recycling outlet, as opposed to being directed by a framework, for example, or having to rely on contractors. So I think the more we can start to regionalise stuff, it's difficult depending on the components you're looking to recycle, whether it's purely artificial turf components or whether it's other plastics as well. They need a number of these pitches to make it work and make it worthwhile from a monetary and a business point of view. But I think if we can find something or bring something into the UK that it's more regionalised, I think it would make things a lot easier in terms of encouraging people to do the right thing when it comes to recycling and refurbishing their pitches.
Yeah, so to jump in there, Catherine, kind of what you hope is that talking about regional facilities and the kind of developing those, well, you would hope that would be part of the Green Deal, you're talking about, because that's very much about jobs, it's about new technology, it's all the things that hopefully fit in there. But unfortunately, I don't see it mentioned anywhere, or have not come across any kind of conversation about that. So it'd be interesting to be talking to government about it.
Thank you, Chris. So we're going to jump forward here, and Catherine, you maybe want to notify us about what the foundation are doing in a wee bit more detail. A couple of minutes on that would be great, if you can.
Yeah, thanks. So as I mentioned earlier, we've just started the third iteration of our artificial grass pitch framework, and as part of this new framework, we want to take a proactive approach to end of life disposal of AGP pitches, and so to do that, or part of that process, we are currently developing a Football Foundation approved list of recycling companies, whereby any company or organisation who is able to recycle either a single component of artificial grass pitches or a number of components are all welcome to apply to become part of the approved suppliers list. We are looking at closed and open loop recycling options. The application process is open. There is no kind of closing date. It will be an ongoing process throughout the framework. So if somebody is currently developing a process and setting up new ways of recycling, there is nothing to stop someone from applying, you know, in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time. We will be open to anybody applying to it. Once the applications come in, they will be assessed by the working group that I mentioned earlier, of the Alliance members. So collectively, we will all agree that they meet the criteria and are then put on the list of suppliers. Once they're on the list of suppliers, the 6 framework suppliers for this current framework will have to utilise one of those companies or a number of those companies in order to recycle and dispose any synthetic turf surfaces that they are removing as part of a refurbishment project. So some of the criteria we'll be looking at would be that you operate a process that has been audited and verified by a recognised environmental technology verification scheme. You operate a quality management system complying with ISO 9001 and also an environmental management system, ISO 14001. If you're an operator of a UK site, you need to have obviously the appropriate environmental permits or be registered for the appropriate waste exemptions, and operators recycling with sites outside of the UK will obviously provide proof that their operations and sites all have the necessary permits. So they're kind of the main criteria. So I think Neil has very kindly agreed that when he sends out the survey, he'll also send out a copy of the invitation for applicants for the approved suppliers list. So if you haven't already seen it or had access to it, hopefully you should get it following the webinar. And if anybody has any queries, my contact details will be on there, so please do get in contact.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We'll definitely send that out with the debriefing email for everyone. So the next one, we're going to just hand over to Eric. He's going to tell us a little bit more about what's going on at the ESTC.
Okay, thank you, Neil. So the ESTC is a trade body for Europe, which represents the synthetic turf industry. And as part of our value proposition to members, education is a big part of what we do. And so they set up a lot of working groups, and we have one working group which I'm chairing. It's called the End of Use Synthetic Turf Systems. And the objectives of that working group are really to provide knowledge to the market, especially purchasers, about what to expect when they buy reuse, recycling, repurposed services or products which contain recycled content. It's also to try and improve the perception by the public of the industry by, you know, presenting a positive image of what we're doing on sustainability and minimising our waste, and obviously to do recycling of synthetic turf systems and shock pads, etc. We also are trying to improve the reputation of the industry. It's had a few, well, over the last 5 years, quite a few fairly bad media interventions. And also we want to highlight best practice, and as these new processes and products come through, we want to be telling that story to the public. There's a few key messages that we're trying to get out there. It's a very hot topic, this. I mean, I only started this working group in April, and I've learned a massive amount in that short period of time, but the amount of webinars and things that have been on in the last few months about this topic, it's incredible. It's such a hot potato. We also want to make sure the guidance recognises what's happening in Europe. Europe has its sustainability development goals and you know, Green Deal for 2030. So we need to recognise all of that in the guidance document we're producing. And we make sure that our group works across all the groups. So whatever we're developing within the trade body, every group's looking at sustainability and recycling now. It's a topic, it's on the agenda. We also want to make sure that any companies coming into this do, as Catherine says, endorse third-party verification schemes. We need to make sure when we endorse recycling or sustainable products, they are third-party approved. And also we want to set the bar very high. We don't want to be setting it low, and you know, we can get to these goals. Set the bar high and try and aim for you know, this closed loop recycling process, as Chris mentioned. Just quickly to finish, the guidance document is already drafted. It will cover many topics, hopefully very educational, but also a bit of a resource for everybody. I would expect that should be checked and peer reviewed by the end of the year, with a target of publication about February next year. So hopefully, the good news is we're consulting with lots of different trade bodies in Europe, so hopefully there will be a lot of common ground there between you know, what the ESTC are promoting and what other trade bodies are saying locally or regionally. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Eric. It's quite encouraging that, you know, we're talking a lot about the UK, but then obviously we're seeing it with the ESTC and in America. There's a lot of action, which is very encouraging. So we're going to jump to the next slide, and I'm aware we're coming up on the hour mark. So if anyone has to leave, we will share the webinar after, so you can rerun it and see the bits that you missed. Very quickly, we wanted to basically look at predictions from the panel. You know, where we're going to be in 2020, 25, 30 and 50. I think probably best if we all pick a number and have a suggestion of where we'll be. So I'll take the easy one and I'll go for 2050. You can see my thoughts that we should have recycling plants in every country. But by all means, guys, jump in on a number.
I'll be more optimistic. I'll go 2030.
You must know something we don't, Catherine.
Yeah, it's going to be very much predicated on investment, isn't it? And I think that is maybe one of the encouraging things, is that investment into sustainable technology has increased hugely. And it's, you know, when you look at the last World G20 summit, you know, it's actually been talked about. And so, yeah, Catherine might be right. If the money comes into the market, then certainly it'll get accelerated a lot quicker.
Okay,
yeah, I would say it's probably a fair timeline. You know, investment is one thing, market demand is another. I think the industry probably is at a tipping point with this. I think there is now recognition across the board that something needs to be done and things need to change, but it's now getting that message out there. As I say, and trying to get that vertical integration across all stakeholders in the industry. So I think even in the last probably 2 years, we've seen momentum building, probably more so in some countries than others, but it's definitely heading in the right direction.
Good. Thank you, Luke. Eric,
I think everybody's identified different strands there, so it's not one thing that's going to change this to get us to 2030 where we've got regional recycling plants. It's legislation, it's procurement, funding. I think the model that Sportex have got is very interesting to encourage a regional approach, because the capital outlay isn't so great to set up a plant. We'll probably see a lot of innovation in that sector in the next 5 years, so that the costs of setting up plants to recover the value of these materials is a lot less. It's not good for Luke if he gets a lot of competition, obviously, but I would say by 2030 we'll be in a very good place as an industry.
Good. That's very encouraging. I'm obviously the pessimist. So, we're going to jump to questions now. We'll jump to the next screen, and at the next screen we're going to pick up some questions that came in already. I'll just cherry pick some of them here because we've got quite a few. The most recent one was the principle has to do with the adoption of pan-European single regulation on recycling. So it's more of a comment. So yeah, we accept that. Do we need to improve guidance on what end of life should look like in terms of surface condition? I suppose that's a good point, because it does come back to performance and life expectancy, and if fields are recycled, then how long is a recycled field going to last for? That's the unknown at the moment, isn't it? What else have we got here? So another one here is, where do trade bodies fit in as part of an education is concerned? So we've touched upon this quite a few times, and I suppose my take on this is very much national versus international, and a lot of the national governing bodies are sometimes led by global governing bodies. So I guess what I would like to see is some consistency and a lot of communication. Has anyone else in the panel got thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is disappointing that sport kind of has been lagging behind in the whole sustainability agenda and implementing it. Other industries have been much quicker and moved much quicker. It's for a whole number of reasons, and you know, having been involved in it myself, I can understand why. And you know, if you take a sport like football, they being a worldwide game, and VAR is probably a classic example of that. You know, you can't just implement something from grassroots to professional across such a huge constituency. So you know, there needs to be a lot of leveling up, if you like, of adopting those sorts of codes of practice across, you know, from such a wide, if you're looking at it across the world in particular. But yeah, there's certainly the putting together the sports and kind of getting them to work collectively is really where it's going to make things happen in a much quicker way. And I think in some ways the whole pandemic has accelerated that. So you know, cricket and the putting on the biospheres and running the sport within those with all those principles in place has helped other sports come back, and so hopefully that kind of shared learning and shared practice will translate into adopting sustainability.
Thanks, Chris. I think someone else has kind of made the same point about EU member states laying down rules on recycling disposal. So I think we're all on the same page here in terms of participants and delegates, which is panelists, which is good. There's an interesting question: have recycled yards been installed on a pitch to date?
Yeah, so it's technically quite difficult to recover the shred and then melt it or recover it from a chemical process and then extrude it back into yarns, because there's little bits of micro-contamination on the yarns with sand and rubber. It's very difficult to clean that off. So there has been successful trials to make turf, but it's never been installed in a field yet.
So it comes back to cost and volume.
It's extremely costly at the moment, using a solvent recovery system. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a volume game. So we need to improve in the numbers. Okay, so I think if any other comments from the panelists before we close, is there any closing statements?
No, just to say, I really do think this is a great piece of work, because I think it helps to pull together a whole number of questions around this particular area, and I think it's given us quite a bit of insight into, you know, what's out there and what people are thinking. So, well done, congratulations.
Thanks, Chris. I think, I suppose it's a very good time to thank everyone that actually participated and fed back. There was 32 questions, so it was a timely exercise, on average about 6 or 7 minutes. So thank you everyone for doing that. And without this information, we can't really drive change. So thank you. And finally, thank the panelists for coming on today, taking time out to discuss these topics that are very sensitive. I may add, it's sometimes not easy to openly discuss these. So thank you to all three of you here, and Eric as well. So on that note, we're going to close. We'll send out the framework application in the email. There will be a rerun of the webinar, and that will come out in an email with the full survey report that we did for all 32 questions.
So we come to the close of the webinar, and we have a lot of learnings. We have the future to look forward to, and we have to have acceptance for change. So will people be willing to pay more for turf in the future? And will people be willing to read more and look for better material? I think the answers to those questions are yes from the survey, but maybe paying more for turf and material is not the future when we have a higher volume. I suppose we need consistency in reading material across the governing bodies and national governing bodies to prevent confusion. And more lead from the national and global governing bodies would be welcomed, and the trade bodies at national level. Independent verification may and should be part of the disposal activities and process, and that might help to alleviate the pressure from the media and the negativity around our industry. The government may have a big part to play, whether it be in tax allowance or legislation, and that's something that might be enforced in the future. But as mentioned previously, we want a voluntary action from all stakeholders. Now, when we revert back to our key focuses at the start, we looked at the knowledge and research resources. This can surely be addressed with the material available and the quality of read. If it's not sufficient, as our participants in the survey have identified, then we should actively put some time and effort into making the material available and counteract that 62% dissatisfied to some degree of participants. The enabling factors are key barriers. There are plenty. We all have a part to play with a wide range of barriers identified from each stakeholder in an industry, and they can only gauge their own ability to have an input to that. I think from tender scoring to key understanding of recycling and legislation or codes of practice, everyone can have their part to play in the process. Quality. In terms of the quality of recycled material, the majority has acceptance, but I think what we need to do here is we need to look at the terminology and try to address each component individually and from the stakeholders' perspective: turf versus infill versus shock pads versus fencing, sub-base material. And I suppose this will relate back to cost, which was number 4 of our key focuses. It's not feasible at the moment to go cradle to cradle. Different components are now warming up and we're getting closer to a full solution. But the turf backing and the polymer is always going to be a big challenge. But we do have entrepreneurs, we do have polymer material experts in an abundance in our industry, and we must remain positive and ready for transition and change when they come along. They will be supported by the likes of legislation and government backing and tax allowances and better knowledge, but I think we do stand in good stead in terms of the people we have in our industry to help make that transition and change. In terms of accessibility, many people talk about this. It needs to be better in the future, and we need to key people to make big steps and commitments, and so volume is resolved. If we can have national access to plants, we are going to have a greener future. We're going to have a more sustainable solution and a feasible cost model, and essentially help protect the planet for future generations. Most importantly, we're seeing an increased awareness, and fundamentally that's what our survey was about. And we have all a part to play in making sports surfaces, specifically artificial turf, that's currently under increased pressure in a sustainable way to change. So on behalf of the panellists, I would like to thank all the participants for joining us today, and I would also like to thank immensely the panellists for their contributions to the discussion today, and they've all taken time out of their day to support this knowledge transfer. The detailed report will be published. You will receive a link and debrief email probably at the end of this week with a webinar rerun, and there'll also be a feedback link to the webinar. Yes, another survey, you may ask. But finally, thank you again. Stay safe, and hopefully 2021 brings good things for everyone.